Why do people fight so hard over flags, borders, and national identity? From the independence movements of Catalonia and Kurdistan to contested territories like Palestine and Taiwan, the relationship between states and nations is at the heart of some of the most heated political struggles today. And so, in this video, we're going to explore concepts of states and nations, how they differ, and why understanding the gap between them is one of the keys to understanding global politics. Before we get started, remember that a state is that institution that possesses a permanent population, defined territory, government, and has the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So, what's a nation? If states are comprised of a group of people, a population, that population might be said to be a nation. More concretely, a nation can be thought of as a group of people who share a common perceived identity. This common identity might be rooted in history, language, religion, culture, ethnicity, or a variety of other factors, though none of these are necessarily determinant of nationhood. And nationhood, at least in theory, is the basis of statehood. But it's important to remember that nations aren't natural or inevitable, they're constructed. Benedict Anderson famously described nations as imagined communities. What he meant was that members of a nation imagine themselves as part of a larger community, even though most will never meet one another in person. Much like fans of a sport team feel a deep bond with fellow supporters they've never met, people can feel a strong sense of belonging to their nation, often rooted in shared stories, language, symbols, and institutions like education or media. These shared experiences help sustain national identity even when national borders are disputed or a nation lacks a formal state. And nationalism, this imagined sense of belonging, can be incredibly powerful, shaping how people see the world and what they're willing to fight for. Or, as Anderson wrote, the nation is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of the fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falseness or genuineness, but by the style in which they're imagined. Finally, the nation is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as to be willing to die for such limited imaginings. In 1918, US President Woodrow Wilson outlined his 14 points, a speech that helped shape peace negotiations at the end of World War I. One of his most influential ideas was the principle of national self-determination, the belief that the borders of states should reflect the identities of nations, and that people have their right to determine their own political future. But while this idea was applied to parts of Europe, it rarely extended to colonized regions. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, colonial powers largely ignored these principles, frequently imposing borders without regard to local national identities. We explore these contradictions in greater detail in another video. But for now, you should know that one of the central principles was the principle of national self-determination, the idea that, ideally, nation and state boundaries should correspond, and that the legitimacy of the state was rooted in the right of the people to determine their own collective future. In a true nation-state, the borders of the nation and the state overlap completely. One nation, one state. We often see this as the ideal in IR theory, but it's rarely the case in practice. Perhaps the best example of this is Japan, where state boundaries and national identities closely overlap. Other nation-states might include Iceland or Portugal. While the nation-state may be considered the theoretical ideal form, it's also incredibly uncommon. Instead, we have multiple alternative forms of the relationship between states and nations. We have multinational states, where a single state is comprised of multiple national identities. This is probably the most common form. We can think of examples like Russia, where Russians are the ethnic majority, but numerous ethnic minority groups like Tatars, Chechens, and many others also exist. Or Belgium, which is divided between Flemish, Wallonians, and Germans. Or Nigeria, which is home to approximately 250 distinct ethnic groups. Or India, or South Africa, or the United Kingdom, or countless others. We also have multi-nation states, cases where a single national group is divided across multiple states. One example we'll explore in more detail later in the course is the Tutsi population, which is spread primarily across Rwanda and Burundi. Despite sharing a common identity, history, and language, the Tutsis have found themselves divided by colonial-era borders, contributing to tensions and conflict within and between these states. Another important case is the Korean nation, which shares a common language, cultural heritage, long history, but is politically divided between North and South Korea. Despite their shared identity, the two states have followed dramatically different political and economic paths since the mid-20th century. The Korean Peninsula remains one of the most visible examples of how a single nation can exist across multiple sovereign states. A broader example might be the Arab nation, whose shared language, cultures, and historical identity stretch across more than 20 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. While many Arabs feel a sense of common identity, the region is politically divided into numerous independent states, each with its own borders, governments, and sometimes competing national interests. We also have what are known as stateless nations, national groups that share a common identity, culture, language, or history, but do not possess a state of their own. These nations are often spread across multiple existing states and lack formal sovereignty or international recognition as an independent country. One of the most well-known examples is the Kurds. The Kurdish people number around 30 to 40 million and are primarily located across Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. Despite a strong shared identity and long-standing efforts to establish an independent state, the Kurds remain divided by international borders. Kurdish aspirations for self-determination have been met by resistance from governments of the states that they live in, sometimes violently, making them one of the largest stateless nations in the world today. Another example is the Palestinians, many of whom identify as a nation without a fully sovereign state. While Palestine has partial international recognition and is a non-member observer state at the United Nations, its sovereignty is heavily contested, much of its territory is occupied, and its borders are not fully controlled by a Palestinian government. Its claims to statehood remain one of the most contentious issues in global politics. The Catalans in northeastern Spain and southern France are another example. Catalonia has a distinct language, culture, and national identity. Although it's an autonomous region within Spain, many Catalans advocate for full independence. Their attempts to hold referenda on self-determination have led to legal clashes with the Spanish government, highlighting how claims to nationhood don't always align with recognized state authority. Other stateless nations include the Basques in Spain and France, Tibetans under Chinese rule, Tamils primarily in Sri Lanka and southern India, the Rohingya, a persecuted Muslim minority in Myanmar, many of whom are stateless in the legal sense as well. Stateless nations often face challenges related to political representation, cultural preservation, and human rights. Their lack of statehood can limit their voice in international politics and may fuel nationalist sentiments, autonomy campaigns, or even armed struggle. In many cases, the desire for full self-determination among stateless nations becomes a flashpoint for regional and global conflict. So, why does the relationship between states and nations matter in international relations? The short answer is that when national identity and state borders don't align, this misalignment often becomes a source of tension and conflict. In multinational states where multiple national groups exist within a single state, like Nigeria, India, Rwanda, or the former Yugoslavia, competing claims to identity, autonomy, or political power can lead to internal instability, successionist movements, or even civil war. In the case of stateless nations, national groups seeking their own state, like the Kurds or the Palestinians, can spark international disputes, refugee crises, or military conflicts, especially when their claims challenge the territorial integrity of existing states. These tensions don't just affect domestic politics, they have major implications for international relations, as conflicts involving stateless nations often draw in external powers, influence regional alliances, or become flashpoints in global diplomacy. This is why understanding the state-nation relationship can help us make sense of some of the most persistent disputes in world politics. So now that we've covered states and nations, let's test your real-world understanding with a few examples. For each case, ask yourself, is it a state? Is it a nation? Is it both? Is it neither? Is the United States a state? Yes, it possesses a permanent population, has a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. It's also recognized by other states as being a state itself, and it possesses sovereignty or supreme decision-making authority. That's an easy one. What about California? Is California a state? No, California is not a state in the sense that we typically mean in global politics. This is sometimes confusing for American students of international relations, since in the US we use the term state to describe subnational units that in other countries are usually referred to as provinces. This is a historical anomaly resulting from the formation of the United States, originally as a union of independent states under the Articles of Confederation, the document which preceded the US Constitution. But while California possesses population, has a territory and a government, it's not recognized by other states as being a state and does not possess sovereignty or supreme decision-making authority. The decisions made by the state legislature can be overturned by federal courts and overwritten by federal law in many areas. As a result, while we use the term state in the United States to describe California, California is not a state in the international relations sense of the term. What about Palestine? Is Palestine a state? Now we're getting into some trickier cases. Palestine has a population, a territory, and a government, and it's recognized by more than 130 other states and is an observer member state of the United Nations. But its sovereignty is contested by Israel, and the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to exercise supreme decision-making authority over its territory is circumscribed. Taiwan is in a similar position as Palestine, but it's recognized by a more limited number of states and is not a member state of the United Nations, having been expelled in 1971 when the Chinese seat was transferred to the People's Republic of China. Since then, it's maintained observer status in some US bodies, but its application for full membership would clearly be blocked by the People's Republic of China. Taiwan nevertheless claims sovereignty and exercises supreme decision-making authority over the island, but is it a state? And what about Kurdistan, the historical region home to the Kurdish people? It occupies a region that spans southeastern Turkey, northern Syria and Iraq, and northwestern Iran. The Kurds are clearly a nation, a group of people with a shared history, culture, and identity, but is Kurdistan a state? This one is a pretty straightforward no. While the Kurds would like to establish an independent state, in its current political formation, Kurdistan is not recognized by other states or the United Nations, and it does not possess sovereignty, so I don't think it's a state. Finally, what about the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine? These territories are internationally recognized as part of Ukraine, but since 2014, they've been controlled by Russian-backed separatist forces. In 2022, Russia claimed to annex both regions along with other parts of Ukraine, but the vast majority of the international community does not recognize these claims. Ukraine maintains de jure sovereignty over these territories. It has legal and international recognition of its authority, but it lacks de facto sovereignty because it does not currently exercise effective control over them. This is a textbook example of how sovereignty can be challenged not just by internal instability, but by foreign intervention and contested borders. And like many of the other cases we've discussed, it shows how sovereignty is not just a legal status, it's also about power, control, and recognition. As we've seen, the terms state and nation may sound similar, but they mean very different things in international relations. And when the boundaries of states and nations don't line up, as they often don't, we get into some of the most complex and persistent challenges in global politics. So whether we're talking about Taiwan, Palestine, Ukraine, or the Kurds, these questions shape diplomacy, war, peace, and identity. As we continue to move through the course, keep asking, who gets to be a state and who gets to decide?